Welcome to Ballot Battleground Nevada. I'm your host, Ben Marjat, a reporter at KRNV News 4 in Reno. I'm passionate about making politics in this critical battleground state more digestible to the average voter and pushing past the talking points to press politicians for answers. On this show, we take deep dives into the people, ideas, and debates shaping Silver State politics. Independent presidential candidate RFK Jr. will be on the Nevada ballot in November. The environmental lawyer and anti-vaccine activist officially filed earlier this month, bringing his longshot White House bid to the Silver State. 538's latest polling average has him hovering around 5% support in Nevada. Obviously not anywhere near enough support to win the race, but is that enough to spoil the election for Harris or Trump? Or is the worry about a spoiler overblown? I'll admit our guest this week made me think about this question in a new way, and I'm so glad we got the chance to talk to him on his summer break. This week, an extended conversation with UNLV poli-sci professor Dan Lee. It comes at a great time, right as the discussion and concern about RFK Jr., not to mention third parties, is ramping up around the country. So let's get straight into our interview with Professor Lee. And I'm so thrilled to be joined now by UNLV Associate Professor of Political Science, Dr. Dan Lee out of Las Vegas. Dan, Professor Lee, thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
How's your brutally hot summer in Las Vegas, Nevada going? Are you jealous of us Northern Nevadans right about now?
I think we learned to cope with it. I'm still able to play some golf even in this heat. You just kind of work your way.
Okay. Yeah. You have to get a 3 a.m. tee time just to avoid triple digits?
Right, yeah.
I see here on your UNLV profile, it says that you are interested in snowboarding. So I imagine you're very much looking forward to getting out on the slopes this winter.
There's that too. Yeah, I've kind of given up on that as far as, it's a little dangerous. So taking a, safer sport in golf, but yeah.
Yeah, fair enough. And not a ton of snowboarding opportunities in Las Vegas.
No, you got to go to Utah, like Bryan Head or, something like that. Yeah.
There we go. Absolutely. Okay. As much as I would love to talk about snowboarding with you for a half an hour, we're talking politics today, which is, of course, your line of work at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. And the reason we wanted to get you on this week was to chat about third parties and independent candidates, because it seems like they might be throwing more of a wrinkle in our 2024 presidential election than they have in years past. Before we get into 2024, though, we'll start with this. Third party candidates, independent candidates, are they spoilers, contenders, pretenders? What kind of role have they played in American politics?
Okay, so I think there's two ways of thinking about it. One is in the short term, like right in that election. They're spoilers, or they're potential spoilers. They're by and large not going to win elections. And that's kind of the big wrinkle, we're talking about this year, is both parties are somewhat worried about, what Robert F. Kennedy Jr., what influence he might have on the election outcome, right? So in the short term, they can be spoilers, although I will say that's pretty rare. In the long term, and this is where my research, what I look into when I think about third parties, is think about what lasting effects they can have on the major parties. So in that sense, they can have some important lasting effects on the major parties. So for instance, you go back to, early 20th century, thinking about like the Progressive Party, or even the late, 19th century with the Populist Party. A lot of their issues were kind of co-opted by the Democratic Party, okay? And thinking about the last really successful third party candidate in presidential elections was Ross Perot in 1992. And in a lot of ways, his issue positions were co-opted by the Republican Party, right? So that's kind of their long-term effect that third-party candidates can have, is where they bring up some issue that one of the major parties kind of co-ops, takes in as their own to try to win over those third-party supporters.
Dating back to the very beginning of American political history, George Washington very famously kind of warned us about separating into different political parties. And obviously, that is the system that we have now with this two-party system.
Parties are something that just kind of naturally forms. When you think about politicians trying to win office, right, it makes sense for them to kind of form political parties in a sense, there's kind of economies to scale, right? When you form a party, when you can run off of a party label. So I think these are things that, the founders weren't necessarily thinking about, but it's something that was inevitable in American politics that we would see, parties form, and we would see partisanship, among politicians, but also voters.
And it seems like millions and millions of Americans, maybe even a plurality of Americans, are unhappy with the two-party system as it is, but it's the system we have. Why are people drawn to third-party candidates? Is it just that overall displeasure with this two-party system?
There's, I guess, two ways we can think about who's drawn to third parties. So we can think about the push and pull towards third parties. So one is that some people are drawn to the third party because of the issues that they are bringing up. Like this voter feels like the major parties are ignoring some important issue or aren't really, pushing an issue like they would want the parties to. So then they turn to a third party. Say you're an environmentalist and you don't think the Democratic Party is doing enough on the environment. So you're kind of drawn towards the Green Party. But then some voters are also pushed away from the major parties where, they feel disaffected by the two major parties. They feel that they're not really, representing the people. So in that case, they're pushed away from the major parties, and they kind of vote for a third party in part like a protest vote, right? Just kind of voicing their displeasure with the major parties. And in that case, they're pushed from the major parties and then end up voting for a third party.
Was the likelihood that the third parties and RFK Jr., the independent candidate, would have a greater impact on this election, was that much higher before Kamala Harris entered the race? Because I feel like there was this sentiment out there that it's a rematch of 2020. People didn't want Biden. They didn't want Trump. And so they just wanted someone else in the race. And so they were more likely to look for alternatives, whereas now there is kind of alternative in Kamala Harris and how this has gone down. Does that make it less likely that the third parties and RFK will have an impact on this election?
Right. I honestly don't really think that switching out Biden with Kamala Harris really changed that much in terms of the underlying dynamics for the upcoming presidential election.
How so?
Well, I just kind of see her more as kind of resetting the presidential race, right? Because in a lot of ways, she's going to have to campaign a lot on what Biden and his administration was able to accomplish. And conversely, a lot of the Republicans are going to tie her to the failures, what they see as the failures of the Biden administration. So she's not an incumbent, but at the same time, being the vice president, she can't, distance herself too much from what's been going on with Biden in terms of his administration. So that's kind of like why I see, again, there was a debate. Biden did poorly. We saw, there's a lot of uncertainty, questions about how Democrats could do. And then replacing him with Harris, I think just kind of resets things, puts it back to, kind of what we're predicting to happen. And in the case of Nevada, we're really predicting a close election, right? Either way, whether it was Biden or Harris. So in that sense, like I kind of view it more as a reset rather than really shaking up the presidential race. As far as like RFK Jr., I mentioned how it's pretty rare for there to actually be spoiler candidacies. And I think that's also going to be the case this year, because I really don't think he's going to win that many votes, right? You're looking at the polls, he's, like polling in the 5% range. Like he's not polling as strongly as, say, back in 2016, where, that was Clinton versus Trump, where people were really, freaking out over the major party presidential candidates. Even in that election, during that campaign, Gary Johnson was polling over 10%. Like there was even questions of whether he can make it into one of the presidential debates because he was performing so well in the polls. Mm-hmm. But come election day, he only wins up a few percentage points, right? And that's kind of the same dynamic. Like why I don't think we're going to see RFK Jr. play much of a role is that his polling numbers aren't as good as the third-party candidates back in 2016. And whatever they are now, he's going to end up winning fewer votes on election day.
Is that just because people kind of realize as the stakes get higher closer to election day that this is ultimately a binary choice?
Exactly. So it's the whole worry about like wasting your vote and contributing to a spoiler outcome. So if you are, a conservative voter, you don't, let's say you don't really like Trump, so you're thinking about voting for RFK Jr., you don't want to waste your vote and potentially throw the election to Harris, right? By voting for someone who has no chance of winning versus you could have voted for Trump and help him win the election. So we call this like Duvergerian incentives, Duverger's law in political science, where voters that support a third party will tend not to actually vote for them because they don't want to waste their vote, essentially. So they vote for the lesser of two evils. So again, people answering poll questions now, yeah, they're saying, yeah, I support, RFK Jr., sure. But when it comes down to actually casting a vote, a lot of voters are going to have second thoughts and ultimately vote for one of the lesser of two evils. Yeah.
In a hypothetical scenario, they like the idea of a third party candidate or an RFK Jr., but when it comes down to brass tacks, you're saying most people kind of ultimately fall in line into one of the major parties.
Right. And even going back to, an earlier statement, you were saying how like a lot of people, you look at the polls, like Gallup has this question of asking, do we need a third party, right? Or are the major parties doing a good enough of a job? And that's been going up. It was back in 2003 is when they started asking that question. It was about 40% of people said we need a third party. Now it's like around 60% of people say that we need a third party. But kind of the irony, or it's a little bit of a mirage, because when you actually look at it, people aren't actually willing to vote for a third party. And it looks like, again, that partisanship is weak among voters. That stat I just gave. A lot of people think we should have a third party. You ask people, what party do you affiliate with? Roughly a third of people say that they're independent, right? Or you look at Nevada, party registration, over 40%, 40-some percent are registered voters, non-affiliated registered voters, right? Independent registered voters. But so it looks like on the surface that partisanship is weak. People are dissatisfied with the major parties. So why aren't they all voting for third parties? Well, it's because partisanship is actually strong among voters. A lot of these people that say that they are independents, a lot of people that say that they support a third party are actually, we call them closet partisans. So where, you ask them, what do you identify with? And they say independent. So then you can ask a follow-up question. Okay, well, if you had to choose a side, which way do you lean? Do you lean Democrat or lean Republican? Those leaners vote a lot like just regular partisans, right?
They just like the label of being called a nonpartisan.
Exactly. Like they want to avoid being, appearing too biased. They want to, they can kind of distance themselves from this, this hyper partisanship and all this, name calling and bickering and fighting, right? So they kind of want to distance themselves from that by just calling themselves independent. But when you actually look at their voting behavior, they vote a lot like, just partisans. Yeah, so there's, roughly a third might say they're independent, but really among those, only a third of those are true independents. So maybe only 12% of voters are actually true independents. And that's kind of just reflective of how actually partisanship, somewhat ironically, is actually very strong today among voters.
Let's talk about the Nevada ballot, though, because there are going to be a decent amount of choices on there this year when it comes to the presidential race. Of course, Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, RFK Jr., the independent candidate that we've talked about. There's going to be a libertarian candidate, Chase Oliver, an independent American Party candidate, which is, for folks out there, different than independent. That's an actual party, IAP. And then potentially the Green Party's candidate, Jill Stein. And then we have the none of these candidates option here in Nevada. I mean, that seems like more options than people have had in years past. So does that mean that there could be more voting for these third parties, or you still are going to stick with what you've been saying, which is that most people will ultimately, when it comes down to it, go Harris or Trump?
Right. Yeah, I think when it comes down to it, people are either going to vote for Harris or Trump. Again, I think by this point, this many years into it, Republicans are pretty comfortable with the idea of Trump, right? Which again, that wasn't the case in 2016. So we saw, Gary Johnson, the Libertarian, do quite well, relatively well in Nevada in 2016. But yeah, there are a lot of these options, but I don't really envision, when you add them all up, that they're going to get much more than 2% of the vote. So like just having more options, I don't think is going to contribute to higher turnout and higher number of people voting for those options.
Yeah, I was looking back at 2016, and even in that election, Gary Johnson, that was kind of the high watermark year, as you've been talking about, for third-party candidate support. And Gary Johnson got only 3.3% of the vote here in Nevada. And we speak of that as an election where these third-party candidates did have a huge impact on the outcome. And then you look at other elections, 2020 and earlier, and third-party candidates in Nevada are combining for a percent or a percent and a half. And
Right.
really, at the end of the day, the elections are very close, but usually being decided by a slightly larger margin than that.
Yeah, but so actually 2016 is one of those cases. So you start off this our discussion asking whether third parties are spoilers. And 2016 was a case where there was potentially a spoiler outcome. So you can look at the total number of votes that Gary Johnson won, and then you can look at the gap between Clinton and Trump. And hypothetically speaking, if all of the libertarian voters voted for Trump instead, then Trump would have won in Nevada, right?
Yeah.
But that's the thing. That's why it's hard. It's actually hard to tell when there's spoiler outcomes, because a lot of those libertarian people that voted libertarian weren't, Trump supporters, or they weren't necessarily conservative voters even. In the sense we think about, they're fiscally conservative but socially liberal, so they could have, taken a lot of Democratic Clinton voters as well. And
a coworker reminded me that he was for legalizing marijuana and a big proponent of environmental reforms. And so it's not so clear cut as all these libertarian voters would have voted for Trump.
Exactly. So people look at that case like, oh, that's a case where it could have been a spoiler. But, I don't, probably not. It was probably closer 50-50 split as far as, who Johnson was taking votes from. Because you even look back to 2000. So that was legitimately an election, Gore versus Bush, where Ralph Nader, a third-party candidate, might have been a spoiler candidate, right? So Ralph Nader was a Green Party candidate. Green Party, pretty clearly a liberal party versus libertarian. They might take some liberal voters, some conservative voters. So even in that election with Nader as the Green Party nominee, again, a liberal party, his support actually, he took a lot of Bush supporters as well. You kind of look at his support. There's some studies that are looking at it, and roughly maybe 3/5 of his supporters might have been Gore supporters, 2/5 might have been Bush supporters. So it's not like 90%, 10%. Is pretty evenly split, because a lot of people that vote for these third-party candidates, they don't really feel strongly one way or the other. Like they're not necessarily the most ideological. It wasn't like all these environmentalists that were voting for Ralph Nader. A lot of his supporters were also just people that were just disaffected with the major parties and just wanted to vote, for someone else, right? So even in that election, where it seems like a third-party candidate would predominantly take votes from one candidate, that's not necessarily true either, right?
And we talked about this on actually a recent episode with RFK Jr., where, he was an environmentalist, obviously the Kennedy family name, long history of Democratic politics in that family. And yet you could also see him pulling votes from Republicans with his anti-vaccine and more conservative beliefs on other policies. So it's not going to break down all for Trump. Yeah.
Right. So as much as, Nader was taking votes from Democratic candidate, I think, RFK Jr. is going to be more like, have more effect that Gary Johnson might have had of, taking more evenly from both sides. And I think that's kind of like one reason why you're hearing a lot of concern among both major parties. It's kind of unclear, like as far as, which way is it going to pull? Is it going to be the environmentalists going for RFK Jr. or is it going to be more of these anti-vaxxers that might go for him? So I think, us looking at it, it's a coin flip, 50-50 probably, but that's the type of uncertainty that campaigns don't like. And that's like why there's concern on both sides.
Yeah. And it's why we're seeing the campaigns try to do whatever they can to keep certain candidates of these third parties off the ballot. The Democratic Party suing the Green Party to try and keep Jill Stein off the ballot here in Nevada. And that case is still pending.
Right. And then even like for RFK Jr. to get on the ballot here was kind of an ordeal.
Right.
Because his initial petitions didn't have his running mate on it. So it was that whole thing. Yeah. And that's a big thing for third parties is it's just ballot access. And it's so difficult for them to get onto the ballot. Like 2016, Jill Stein, was she the nominee in 2016 as well?
Yeah.
I think she was, for the Green Party. And they were not on the ballot in Nevada in 2016. Right.
Yeah, so, I think I saw they haven't been on Nevada's ballot since 2008. So it's been a while for them. In my research, I found that, it was 1968 was the last time a candidate actually won electoral votes, a third party candidate, I should say. 56 years. And we're in this era where it's harder for these third party candidates to really win electoral votes. What's it going to take to change that dynamic?
Okay. So given our current system of how we allocate electoral votes, where it's winner take all. So whoever wins the most votes in a state, they get all of the electoral votes from that state. So in this current system, we can contrast 68 versus 92, right? So George Wallace, won a bunch of southern states, electoral votes in southern states, versus Ross Perot, won more votes nationwide. He won over 19% of the vote, which is more than what George Wallace won, but he didn't win any electoral votes. So the issue there was that Ross Perot's support was basically just spread throughout the nation, right? Where he didn't he didn't have a plurality of support in any given state. Versus George Wallace, his support was mostly among Southern white conservatives. So he was able to win some of those Southern states, right? So that's what it would take for a third-party candidate to be able to win electoral votes. Is not only do they have support, but their support needs to be condensed enough within a region, within certain states, where they're able to win a plurality of the votes, to then, again, with a winner take all, win all those electoral votes. So then you might ask, like, what are these regional issues? And I mean, unfortunately, it might, race, civil rights, like those kind of things.
Yeah.
We talk about kind of the politics, just the red, blue map, the coastal cities, the coasts versus middle America, right? So you see some potential for that, but I don't think, I would hope we don't go back to the 1960s as far as, the South. But so that's why I think it's going to be hard for us to see a third-party candidate, because I can't envision an issue that would get enough support in a region.
What about ranked choice voting? Since Nevada is going to be voting on question 3 in the fall, and in Nevada's case, it doesn't actually apply to the presidential race. But if states were to switch to ranked choice voting, could that potentially lead to a scenario where these third-party candidates can amass more support than they get right now?
The answer is yes. So they can definitely get more electoral support, because we talked about why a lot of third-party supporters don't vote for a third party when they're actually voting, is because they don't want to waste their vote and potentially lead to a spoiler outcome where their less favorite major party candidate wins. So the reason why ranked choice voting could alleviate that is where, let's say I'm a liberal Democrat and I'm thinking about voting for a Green Party candidate, right? Again, under a normal election, a vote for the Green Party might help a Republican beat the Democrat. I really don't want that. Under ranked choice voting, I could vote for, as my top choice, the Green Party, and put as my second choice, the Democratic Party. So the way ranked choice voting, how it works is the candidate with the fewest votes in the first round, they get eliminated. So in my case, the Green Party candidate would probably win the fewest votes. They would get eliminated. So then we now move to my second choice vote, which is to the Democratic Party, right? So that allows me to vote for the Green Party without necessarily wasting my vote. Because once the Green Party is eliminated, my vote for the Democratic Party is then counted, right? So that will contribute to third-party candidates winning more votes, but that won't necessarily really help them win elections. Right.
Sure.
So that might help them win votes. And that's important because I kind of mentioned ballot access. So this varies by state law, but pretty much in all the states, one way that minor parties can keep ballot access is to perform well enough in elections. Right. So having something like ranked choice voting could help third parties win enough votes to keep ballot access. Right. But then we'll see, more third parties are, active and in elections, but I don't think that's necessarily going to contribute to them actually being able to win elections, right?
Gotcha. Well, this has been a fascinating conversation. Before we wrap, though, final question. Which campaign should be more worried about the impact of a third-party candidate right now, or are they all worrying a little bit too much about this? The Harris campaign, the Trump campaign, or it's overblown?
Yeah, I think it's overblown. It's, again, they're going to take votes from both sides. I don't think it's going to be that many votes. So, if I gave, to give advice to the campaigns, they should just focus on their campaigns and honestly not worry about RFK Jr.
There we go. Well, I'm so glad we were able to chat with you this week, because there is a lot of conversation and discussion about RFK and some of these other minor candidates. So really thrilled to be able to get some of your expertise in this topic. Professor Lee, thank you so much. We will have to have you back sometime in the fall when this is all ramping up and right before election time. We'll have you back sometime soon. If you made it to the end of this episode, thank you so much for listening. If you have guest ideas, episode ideas, questions, comments, compliments, concerns, feel free to shoot us an email to bjmargiot, MARGIOTT, at sbgtv.com and put Ballot Battleground Nevada in the subject line. And if you have a minute, I'd really appreciate it if you left a rating and a review. Also, tell a friend, a family member, a coworker. Word of mouth is the best way to spread Ballot Battleground Nevada across the Silver State. Thanks so much for listening. We'll see you next week.